There's a lot to be said about living outdoors. You hear everything. Every bird, every barking dog, every child crying to get back home, and every drunken row. You hear it all. That's one of the best things, if not the only good thing, about living in a wooden Wendy house in your own back garden. The world moves along and yet no one knows you're listening. It's fascinating, isn't it? It may be a bit rude, a bit intrusive, some may find, but overall very fascinating. Now, you may think that if one happens to live in an old playhouse, then I must have fallen on hard times, or I've been thrown out, or become the latest recruit to some form of cosmic karma. Well, you think wrong. Poor old George, they say. Isn't it sad how he sits alone in that Wendy house with nothing to show for his life? Poor George. Poor nothing. If truth be told, I enjoy it. I have a roof, a door, and these wooden walls are so robust, not even a double-decker bus could get through them. Last Christmas, I stayed in here whilst it was the bitterest of weather conditions. Snow and rain and storms and everything the good Lord could throw at us, but nothing was getting past these walls. I just sat in here, all snug and relaxed. Mrs. Pollard in number 23 lost part of her roof. She went insane, shouted and swore her head off. Mind you, everyone takes a roof for granted, don't they? And whilst I felt sorry for the old dear, I could not help but chuckle my little head off, knowing that a bit of 25-year-old plywood could hold better than the £2,000 roof repair she had had done that summer. I just leaned back, chuckled, and kept eating my Christmas meal on a tiny plate. Oh, that's another point. You probably are wondering how I can keep this place heated. Nothing beats a good old Cala gas heater. Keeps me toasty, cooks up a few bits of food to keep me going, and even good for, drying my delicates, but that's a story for another time. Maybe not even then. You get used to it after a while. Well, living in this place for a good 8 years, you have no choice but to get used to it. It's not so bad. I have everything I need right here. Then I have Shannon coming over every week with my shopping. She's my daughter, only daughter. Shirley, my dear wife, and I were never fortunate enough to have others. But Shannon doubles up the bliss. She's a lovely girl. A bit odd, but good. She has a tattoo of some wizard thing on the far left side of her chest. She never told me she's got it, but I noticed a while back. I just didn't want to be embarrassed, so I just left it. Anyway, she pops down the shops every week, and brings me some bits to keep me ticking and some batteries for my trusted radio. Oh, I also ask her to take off the labels from the tinned things. "I never understand why you want the labels off, Dad," she says. "You'll never know what you're eating, you daft sod." That's part of the fun, though, isn't it? Every meal is a lucky dip. One day I could be eating spaghetti hoops on tinned peaches. On another, it could be beef stew and custard. My most favourite, spam with cherry rice pudding. Bellissimo. She smiles about it, does our Shannon, but she walks away with a hint of sadness in her eyes. I know why it is, though. She worries. She worries over me as I do over her. She often tells me, "You and Mum looked after me my whole life. I wish you'd let me look after you." "Shannon," I reply, "it does not matter if you are 4, 14 or 104. My job is always to look after you. So, stop your fussing and spend your energies looking after those grandchildren of mine. They need it more than I do." It was not always like this, though. I wasn't born in a shed or a playhouse, to my knowledge at least. I have a house, the one adjacent to this garden, right there. I could live in there if I really wanted to. It has space and furnishings and warmth. I could happily live in there, but I can't. No, because I choose not to. I grew up in that house with my mother and father. Father travelled a lot with the armed forces, and mother was a bit, well, severe, let's say. We lived happily enough. We were often cold and living a life of uncertainty, but we were happy. I then met Shirley, my wife, my soulmate. Her indoors. Oh, don't tell her I said that. I was a teacher at the local comprehensive, and she worked in the school reception. She was often a great source of espionage. She would often tell me which kids liked me, which kids hated me, and which were ready to throw a paper plane at my head that afternoon. We got together on a school trip to Llandudno. We both had chips on the pier before this great, big, massive seagull flew in and scared the life out of Shirley. She clung onto me for dear life and was completely scared out of her wits. Anyway, you can figure out the rest, I'm sure. The pupils sure did. And so, we married and eventually took over this house. We lived here for 30 plus years. We had Shannon in that time, as well as 2 dogs, an hamster and a snake. Shannon went through a phase. Don't ask. Shirley and I built this Wendy house just for Shannon and her friends. They would spend hours in this playhouse through all sorts of weather. It brought them love and safety. Shannon grew up here and eventually found her own path. Shirley took it worse than I did. I remember that on the first night Shannon moved away, I switched off the landing light. For the first time in 22 years. That light ceased to be, and whilst I beamed with pride that our daughter had spread her wings, Shirley had a little cry to herself. She tried to hide it, but I always said that she would be the last person to take to a poker game. She laughed, of course, and the tears quickly faded when she realised that she could now use the spare room for her book club. With Shannon gone, and having to be cautious with funds over the years, I decided to retire from teaching. Teaching had changed by that point. It was all too much red tape. By the time I chose to retire, I felt like the most uneducated person in that school. Shirley wasn't ready to move on yet, so she stayed for a few hours a week because she missed the kids too much. Deep down, I think she saw them as a substitute for the other kids she could never have. Retirement was now the thing, and we both used it to our advantage. The playhouse still existed, but the grandkids could wallow in its safety. I also think Shannon still enjoyed its presence. They would often stay here and look after the house while Shirley and I travelled. We didn't travel the world by any means, but we went to places that made us happy. Whether it was climbing the mountains of Snowdonia or eating chips on the pier, it brought us joy and our own memories as we grew older. Life was joyous beyond words. Then, one day, Shirley asked me 3 times if I wanted a cuppa. 3 times in 10 minutes. I assumed that it was just her flakiness at first, but then it went on and on. Before long, she made me a sandwich without knowing why, or she left the bath running. At one point, she got her favourite vase and put it into microwave, setting it at full power for a 20-minute turn. She nearly burnt the house down. At first, she laughed, but then she sat down and began to cry. She sobbed uncontrollably, shouting and screaming at me. "Who let you in the house?" she bellowed. "I never let you in. Get out! Get out!" At that moment, I never wanted a cuppa more. Shirley battled for many years. A lot of the nurses we saw would often say how lucid and witty she was at the sessions. It was moments like that when Shirley, my Shirley, came back. In those moments, she'd reminisce about the pier and the kids and the playhouse. That was before she would blink and then forget who I was again. Sometime later, at her bedside, she showed one last ounce of lucidness. In one very brief moment, with no one else around, she grabbed me. She clung onto me with the same fear and ferocity as the day that seagull flew past us. She held onto me so hard, shaking, but in the same calmness. She knew she was safe in that moment. She remembered. She remembered it all. And then, a few moments later, she died. She died remembering who she was. That was 8 years ago. I returned home that evening, but it wasn't our home anymore. It was an empty space, a quiet and cold shell of the life it once held. I descended into the garden and I looked ahead and saw this place, the Wendy house. This house that generated love and laughter and silliness. I took our favourite blanket and slept in here. In truth, it was the best sleep I'd had in a long time. It still is. Since that day, I have never stepped back into that shell. This is my home now. This is the house that Shirley and I built. I can cope with the moments of sadness. Well, we all have to, don't we? But the joys and the moments in between are what makes a life worth living. I can never return to that house because the sadness and the grief live there. Whilst at the Wendy house, I still feel like she's here, like they're all here, and we're all still living for those moments of joy. This is not just a playhouse. It's not just a shed or a Wendy house. It's my safe house. But more importantly, it brings life. And for me, it's a life worth living. Time to go now. Lucky dip time.
Somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me, my lover stands on golden sands and watches the ships that go sailing. Somewhere